Hey everybody, it is James Lindsay and you are listening to the new Discourses podcast, and today it's high time we read the Communist Manifesto. Now, obviously I've been meaning to do this for a long time. I meant to read the Communist Manifesto to you kind of a long time ago, several years ago, as a podcast or series. This is actually going to be two parts. I'm going to read the main body of the Communist Manifesto in this part, and in the next part I'm going to read this kind of literal Q&A about the goals and aspirations of the Communist Party, which is part of the manifesto, for a second episode. But I was planning to read this to you years ago, and I just didn't think it was interesting enough. And maybe that's because I didn't really understand it yet. The hardest part about dealing with Marxist or woke literature in general is that you don't understand it until you understand it. I think this is part of how it survived so thoroughly, even within, the universities, within academia, within high-level professionals. There's a lot going on, and if you don't understand the kind of metaphysical underpinnings to the whole project, you don't understand what you're reading. You can take it, in fact, at face value. You can take it at various different levels of comprehension. But if you don't understand what's really under the hood, which takes lots of knowing about background things and lots of times reading it to kind of pull apart the way it's written, then you'll make mistakes. And this is why I think we've been plagued for this was written in 1848. And so what's that, 177 years, I guess, just doing the math quickly, of plagued with communism in the world. Now, of course, most of communism there was communism before the Communist Manifesto, and there wasn't a lot of actual communism as a world phenomenon until Lenin made it a real world thing by taking over Russia and creating the Soviet Union in 1917. But nevertheless, this was written in 1848. Many of you will have heard. In fact, I did recently a podcast reading from several sources of Marx from 1843 and 1844. So earlier than this. So many of you will know that I take very seriously Marx's earlier writings. I'm actually less interested in his later writings. I think that the substrate was laid in the early writings, and I think they are the kind of key. I don't think he ever renounced what he wrote, whereas, for example, I've written things that I still have them available because I believe in intellectual and academic transparency and honesty, but I don't really stand necessarily by the arguments that I made fully, and we've done that on the podcast before too. I don't think Marx ever backed away from his earlier writings, and I think they actually serve as the metaphysical, even ontological foundation for what he was doing. And so I don't think it's possible to comprehend what we're reading without it. Now, the Manifesto of the Communist Party, just speaking historically, is a curious document. I did not review the history before I started to record this, so I'm just going to touch on it. It was at some point before it became the Manifesto of the Communist Party in the hands of Marx and Friedrich Engels, who wrote it with him, which is basically why it's readable. It was called the Communist Confession of Faith, or the Confession of the Communist Confession of Faith. And there's a whole interesting history that I'd have to read again to relate it to you. I've read it a couple times, but I don't remember it, about how this document came to be from that earlier document. And there's some, skullduggery and all these kind of weird stuff going on in terms of how it came to be. But anyway, I'm just going to go through the preface, the very famous preface, and then the two chapters of the main body of the Communist Manifesto for you in this episode. We're just going to read it, going to tell you what the stuff means, where it needs kind of elaboration. And in the next episode of this kind of mini-series, I'm going to go through this kind of Q&A thing that's further down after he addresses a bunch of objections that people have, and so on. This part, the main body of the Communist Manifesto, is actually only about 14 pages long. It's not super long. It's not nearly as long as people think. The document I'm reading from, that I got off of the Marxists.org website, is in fact 116 pages. It has tons and tons of all these prefaces written to different editions that were published and in different languages and then there's all this kind of material afterwards. But the real thing, the real body of the thing is really just these maybe 13 or 14 pages in the middle, starting on page 31 of the document that I have, which I'll probably link to so that you can follow along. But let me just kind of give you the framing so you can follow where it's all going, because this is the key thing you've got to understand, that the Communist Manifesto lays out the goals of the Communist Party. It doesn't specifically define communism. You kind of can pick that up from other places like Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts. It does say what it is and does to a degree, but it is actually not just the Communist Manifesto. The title is the Manifesto of the Communist Party. And so it's actually outlining the creation of the Communist Party and what it's going to do. Like I said, there are three essential pieces, at least to this main body of the manifesto. There's a short preface, less than a page. It's very poetic. Then there is a first chapter, which is bourgeois and proletarians, which explains the relationship between the two fundamental classes that Marx believed characterized industrial capitalist society in the 1840s. And I have to put it that way because it's very, very important to understand his class argument and how it changes through history, but I'll come back to that in the summary in a second. The second chapter is Communists and Proletarians, and it describes the relationship that the Communist Party has to the proletariat. Okay, so proletariat means workers, by the way. It's not even peasants, although that obviously became relevant in Russia and in China when Mao took over. But it didn't mean peasants. It actually meant workers, factory workers. It meant people who came to the city primarily or who were city dwellers, but a lot of them were peasants who left their peasant life in the villages and came to the city and got jobs in factories and became a new kind of working class slaves to an overclass that he refers to as the capitalist bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie is a French word, obviously. The German equivalent is, and I can never say this right, is Bürgerlicher or Bürgerlicher. I don't know how you say German things. I studied it in 2019 for 2 weeks and then forgot all my German. And so, except Apfelsaft, which means apple juice. And so, at any rate, the Bürgerlicher are city slickers, is what the bourgeois are. The bourgeoisie refers to city slickers. Okay, it's so people that live, Bürger means city, it's or people of the city. It's people that live in the city. And so it's the kind of urban elite, if you want, that is living large off of the society produced by the workers through the capitalists who are exploiting them. And the capitalists and the bourgeoisie are therefore in kind of cahoots. And in fact, there's great overlap between them. But let's go back to the summary. The first chapter explains the relationship, like I said, between the bourgeoisie and proletariat. The second chapter explains the relationship between the proletariat and the communists. And the relationship is very simple. There is a class conflict that defines all of history. That's what it means to believe the Marxist Manichaean Gnostic structure of reality. His socio-Gnosticism, as I've called it before, is that there is an intrinsic society-defining conflict between the owning class and the people who do all the work, the working class kind of in general. And that isn't just limited to bourgeoisie and proletariat. That can be slave masters and slaves. That can be feudal lords and their serfs. At different stages in history, the same relationship, which is an intrinsic class conflict of owners versus workers, or the owners versus the real people, is the defining characteristic of history. And periodically there's a complete revolution in how society runs. And that revolution evolves society from one stage in that conflict to another. Or it causes a collapse of the existing society. So Marx believed that the society is evolving along this line, and that there's this intrinsic relationship in his time between the capitalists or the bourgeoisie and the proletarians, which is the working class, which is a class conflict that is the not just society defining entity, or as I phrase it usually, the fundamental organizing principle of society is a conflict between the contending classes. It is also indicative of the entire purposed movement of history. Okay? And so the first chapter describes a relationship of exploitation by the bourgeois class of the proletariat working class. The second chapter, like I said, is the relationship between the proletariat, which the first chapter identifies as the necessary revolutionary class of its time, and the communists are described in the second chapter as its most advanced segment that must lead it into the revolution. So this is a revolutionary manifesto for a revolutionary party called the Communist Party, and the Communist Party is going to lead the revolutionary class, which is called the proletariat, and the proletariat is the working class, needs to understand, this is the first chapter, needs to understand its relationship, which is effectively Gnostic alienation and exploitation by the producing class above it. Okay? That's the basic structure of the Communist Manifesto. There is an intrinsic class conflict that defines history. It changes form from one epoch to the next, but it's always the same fight. It changes form via bloody and violent revolutions that are a huge upheaval of the existing order or cause complete ruin of society. In each period, there is an oppressor class and there is an oppressed class. And yes, Marx says that explicitly. The oppressed class needs to awaken to its conditions so it can overthrow the oppressors. That's the revolution that must come. The proletariat is the oppressed, thus revolutionary class, but it'll only become revolutionary when it is awakened. And there's the Communist Party will serve as its vanguard to lead it this way. So there's an important point to pull here from the whole thrust of the body of the Communist Manifesto, and that is that this is a huge lie. The whole purpose of the Communist Manifesto is to pretend that the communists are on the side of the workers, and that in fact they're the most advanced segment of the workers, and they're going to lead the workers to the promised land of socialism and communism, which will set them free from their alienation and exploitation. That's literally the promise. That's literally the sales pitch. But the whole thing is a giant lie, because what you see is chapter 1 sets up, here's the conflict, here's the revolutionary class, we need you to be agitated for revolution. And by the way, chapter 2 says, and we're going to lead you through all the stages of revolution as the Communist Party. So what this actually is a power grab by the Communist Party in the name of the people, which historically we see every single time it's ever been attempted or implemented, it exploits and alienates the people worse. It is a catastrophe in action. And there's tons of reasons to understand why that's the case, the dictatorship of the proletariat and other things that are written about, and all the other Marxist writings. It's a very awful and exploitative system. But the point is that the leaders of the Communist Party, namely Marx and Engels, writing the manifesto, the leaders of the Communist Party are going to be in charge of the Communist Party. The Communist Party is going to be in charge of the movement, and the movement is going to be in charge of the workers. And you end up with this kind of power grab for a very, very small number of people to concentrate the wealth and power of society into the hands of the most elevated Communist Party members in the name of the large, broad masses. So this is the fundamental deception at the heart of all of these woke projects, whether it's communism, whether it's woke as we say it today on the left, whether it's fascism, the same idea, different implementation, same idea. The true representatives of the society need to seize power, order everything to their own benefit for the benefit of everybody. So Hitler was doing it in the name of the folk, and the Soviets were doing it in the name of the people, and Mao was doing it in the name of the people, and Karl Marx is doing it in the name of the workers or the proletariat or the peace people or the masses, and which is also wording that Hitler used. It's the same project over and over and over again. It is the same swindle over and over and over again. The leaders of the Communist Party with the Communist Party around them, will own and run everything after the revolution, because they are the vanguard of that revolution, and the proletariat, or whatever agitated masses that they whip up, the folk, the people, whatever it is, heritage Americans, are the cannon fodder to make the revolution happen, to hand all the power to not just the Communist Party, but the leaders of the Communist Party. Usually one or two dictators like Stalin or Mao at the end of the day, and maybe a little bit their inner circle. So the whole thing's a giant swindle. And if you don't understand that, when you read it, you miss it. And so that's why I wanted to give this summary of how the Communist Manifesto is organized, what it actually says, and what it's actually meant to achieve. The real point is that Marx and Engels get all the power in the name of the Communist Party, in the name of the people, and the people are convinced that they're exploited, so they have a revolution so that they can be exploited by the Communist Party. And if you don't understand that that's the message of the Communist Manifesto, you missed the whole story. So let's read the Communist Manifesto. Manifesto of the Communist Party. And this is by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It was published in 1848. And everything has sucked on the left ever since. It starts very famously. It starts this way. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. So the first thing we pick up from this opening sentence, this famous poetic opening sentence of the Communist Manifesto, is that they didn't invent communism. It's a specter that's haunting Europe. Europe is flirting with these ideas. It has been at least since the French Revolution, during which Gracchus Babeuf and others attempted to set up a commune in Paris. This isn't the famous Paris Commune, which was not in the 1790s, but was rather in the 1870s. This is a different, but communism has been on the table, something people have been looking at and discussing, primarily people within a lot of secret societies in Europe, weird secret societies, had been looking at and entertaining already when the Communist Manifesto is being written and published. They are not saying, hey, here's this new idea. They are saying it's time for this idea to get organized and put into action. That's why it's the Manifesto of the Communist Party, not the Manifesto of Communism more generally. It says, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies. So there's this specter, everybody, it's haunting Europe. Communism's in the air. Communism's coming. Communism's nowhere established, and all the powers are trying to get rid of it. So they start off with their wound-collecting victim narrative. And he says, where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? So he's like, so there's communism, it's haunting Europe, the powers don't want it. We need a party. Where is it? We need it to get organized. The communists need to organize. Where is the party that can do this? He says two things result from this fact. One, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. So once again, I'm reminding you, it's not being invented in the Communist Manifesto. They're sticking a stake and saying we're going to organize and achieve it. Two, it is high time that communism should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the specter of communism with a manifesto of the party itself. Okay, so we're not going to lurk in the shadows anymore. We're going to organize a party. We're going to publish our aims. We're going to come out of the shadows, and we're going to try to take power. That's the purpose. He says, to this end, that's the end. I just read the purpose. To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. Chapter 1. Bourgeois and Proletarians. And so there's an asterisk on the title here, and it says, by bourgeoisie is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production. Listen to that. Not owners of the means of physical production, not even economic production, owners of the means of social production and employers of wage labor. By proletariat, the class of modern wage laborers who have no means of production of their own are reduced to selling their labor power in order to live. So the bourgeoisie is what I described before, and the proletariat are specifically the workers who have to sell their labor to the manufacturing processes in order to make their way. That can include within the service industry, not just within the production industry. Okay. The history, it famously begins, and I've read this a few times in the podcasts before, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That is the first meaningful sentence of the Communist Manifesto, and it is a declaration of a metaphysical belief, an ontology of man, a complete anthropology, as a matter of fact. The history of all hitherto existing society. All, he says in the footnote, written history. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. So the thing we call society itself is in fact a gigantic, protracted class struggle. There is only one way to understand all of history, meaning that which is written history of man, which is that there are two, broadly construed, two classes, and they are in conflict with one another, struggling with one another for control of society itself. He goes on to describe these classes at various times in the historical development of man. He says, free man and slave, patrician and plebeian. So the free man are the bourgeoisie of a particular era, I should say, and slaves are the proletariat of that era. Patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, not sometimes in opposition, not sometimes harmonious, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. This is so important that not only did I do a short podcast about it alone the other day that you can go find, it is also absolutely crucial to understanding what makes woke woke. It is absolutely crucial to understanding the fundamental worldview in which Marxism operates or communism operates, or even its reactionary elements like fascism operate or neo-reaction operates. It's all down to this, that there is intrinsically a fight. The entire history of society is characterized by that fight. There is no escaping the fight. The fight is definitional to the history of the society itself. It takes different forms over time, but it is constant class opposition. In sociological terms, there is always some stratifying line drawn through society, and the people above the line and the people below the line are in constant conflict. There is always a Manichaean dyad of good versus evil, which is characterized by oppressor versus oppressed. In a word, he says, that characterizes the fundamental organizing principle of society. And that fight is sometimes visible and it's sometimes invisible, but it's always what's really going on. It is the sole determining factor of everything. Why do the critical race theorists think that everything in the universe you can imagine is racist? Because they believe that the bourgeois class, with regard to the racial line of stratification, controls the means of social production, and whether that fight is external and visible or internal and hidden, racism is always at the bottom of an intrinsic conflict that never ends in society, which defines a power dynamic and a power grab that you have, for them, the white supremacists holding off the racial minorities. You can invert this power dynamic at any time to get from communism to fascism. I don't know if it's going to come out at the time of this recording, but I recently sat down and did an episode of the Dark Horse podcast with Brett Weinstein. Mike Nana was also there. And at one point, we're all trying to communicate about the concept of woke right. And so it's not going well. And so I divert and I say, Brett, you're an evolutionary biologist. Give me the mimetic evolution to your best of your understanding from Marxism or communism to fascism. How do you start with communism and get fascism? Is there a mimetic evolution between them? And if so, what is it? And he says some things, but all you have to do is take this structure and invert it. That's the whole thing. It's like a mutation, if you want to use that language, in the mimetic structure that reverses part of the core message. The message of Karl Marx is that there's this conflict defining the entire movement of history that is oppressor versus oppressed, and that's a problem. So the oppressed have a reason to organize. The Communist Party will organize itself to lead them in order to revolt against the existing society, overthrow what is, and undo oppression allegedly. They never succeed at this. They just never do, not even close. But that's the message. The fascist reaction is to see how the communists bring this message to society, screw everything up, make things a big problem, and they say, aha, the communists were right about part of it. Marx's analysis is right, but his solutions are wrong. That's the message. Hitler said it. Mussolini said it. I don't know if Franco said it, but I bet he did. And the woke right say it all the time. Now, Marx's analysis was right, but his solutions were wrong. History is, in fact, defined by class consciousness. By class conflict, by class struggles. History is defined by this struggle between oppressor versus oppressed, but the reason it works when it works is because of oppression. So as long as the oppressor is allowed to oppress, then we can have a society that functions. But now we've lost that. And we're alienated from the society we could have had, so we're going to organize a fascist or neo-fascist or National Socialist or Nazi or whatever party to guide us back to a society of order and duty predicated on oppression rather than a bogus radical egalitarianism calling itself tolerance. So communism brands its absolute equality for everybody as extreme tolerance, as the end of tolerance, the purpose of tolerance, or what it reaches at its zenith, its ideal state. And the fascists rightly understand that's not going to work. So then they wrongly pick up the analysis and they say it was in fact intolerance that made the whole system work, and we're going to be intolerant artificially rather than through, say, the certification of people's competence. In a natural hierarchy. So this idea of no hierarchy for the Marxists, natural hierarchy for sane and realistic people, and enforced rigid artificial hierarchy for the fascists is the kind of trichotomy of ways of seeing the issue. But the point is, you get to fascism from Marxism by taking this opening paragraph of the Communist Manifesto and inverting one point. It's not oppression that's a problem. It's oppression that made it work. All of fascism follows from that. Every bit of it. The only other difference is that the national identity becomes central rather than overcoming localized national identities in the name of global radical egalitarianism. So that cobbles on to whatever else, to this reversal, pro-oppression reversal, while accepting the fundamental premise. Marx had the correct analysis, but the incorrect solutions. It then cobbles on nationalism as a identity category to reject internationalist radical egalitarianism. Whew, mouthful. That's it. So that's the essence of basically everything. That's the basis of woke, frankly. And that's why fascism or reaction is also woke. It takes the same woke architecture, the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggles, and it doesn't matter how you characterize them from one era to the next. It's always oppressor versus oppressed that are in constant opposition to one another. And the Marxists say that conflict needs to be overcome and ended. And the fascists say that conflict is what makes everything work. And then Marx gives you two options. This is a threat. It's not a statement. It's a threat. A fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So with the woke right, for example, they will revolutionary reconstitute MAGA or they'll destroy it. The woke left will revolutionary reconstitute the Democrats or they will destroy them. And they will both of them will revolutionary reconstitute America or they'll destroy it. You get the message? They will come in and they'll take over, say, how critical race theory did. In 1984 and 5, critical race theory came in to the critical legal studies movement, which was an extraordinary left-wing movement in law, which ironically enough I've recently learned, but I don't remember the details, has some roots into some of the woke right thinkers, as it turns out, and not just the woke left ones. I'm trying to remember which ones. Maybe I'll come back to me at some point, or maybe we'll do a podcast about it later. But anyway, the critical race theorists come in 1984 and 5 to the critical legal studies movement, and they immediately accuse everybody of being racist. And what happens? Well, suddenly there's a revolution happening in the critical legal studies movement, which is basically nothing now. There is no real critical legal studies movement anymore. It's now critical race theory. So in between 85 and 89, the CLS movement falls apart and CRT rises out of the ashes in 1989, which is, you could consider it a revolutionary reconstitution of the left-wing approach to law, or the critical legal approach, to turn it into critical race theory, in other words, based in a universal racial struggle as the key founding idea, the fundamental organizing principle of society and specifically law here, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So since the CRT people took over, it wasn't the total common ruin, it just ruined the critical legal studies movement. So alternatively, what could have happened is that this fails, but then the critical legal studies movement is branded as racist. It loses all of its steam. The critical race theorists never get off the ground, and they destroy both movements. That's what Marx says every time this conflict flares up and gets to. So I already gave you the warning for America, for MAGA, for the Democrats. We already have seen it play out in the Democrats. We're watching it play out the rest of the way. Will they get America with the woke left? Who knows? Will the woke right get MAGA? Who knows? Will they eventually get America? Who knows? Will that throw it back to the woke left? Who knows? But Marx goes on, and I don't want to spend all day talking about it. I want to get through this. In the earlier epochs of history, Marx tells us, and Engels, we find almost everywhere a complicated... It's a good time to remind you, by the way, as I read this, that this is also the Communist Confession of Faith. This is what they believe religiously with faith. What does faith mean? Faith means you don't know for sure that it's going to come about, but you believe it as though it has been promised by something omnipotent. For Marx and Engels, the omnipotence is the march of history itself. That's the omnipotent force. And so they put their faith, their trust, their confidence that this is how society transforms. They believe it's a science of history that they've discovered, but science here is in the Hegelian sense, which is dialectics. It is not, in fact, real science. In the earlier epochs of history, they tell us we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. So societies are stratified throughout all of history. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. So society is stratified. This, by the way, is also the basis, what you just heard is the basis for intersectionality. Why? Because what you have is all of these different classes of society, and you can see each pairing of them, in fact, as a class struggle, even though that there's somewhere a major line drawn, but as the major class struggle of all of society. So you, as Richard Delgado puts it with Gene Stefanchik in the Critical Race Theory and Introduction, he talks about how the fight for racial justice in CRT gets more and more complicated as you go deeper down into different races. So you've got Latinas, and you've got like Chicano, and you've got like Asian, and all these different races scrabbling for where their power dynamic lands, right, within the broader thing of critical race theory, which is the racial stratification theory and conflict theory of society that CRT represents, which is white versus people of color, but there's lots of kinds of people of color. What he's saying is, well, you have the lords, and then below that you have vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. So the guildmasters, for example, are under the vassals, so there's a conflict there. The vassals are under the lords. The guildmasters are also under the lords, so there's a conflict there. But the direct conflict is guildmaster versus journeymen who work for them, so that's its own like sub-conflict. This is the same as splitting down into the various races, or into splitting intersectionally into, well, we have the overall fight of, white versus people of color, but we have to implicate men versus women, so feminism as well, right? So it's a more complicated fight. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations, he points out. So the same conflict is playing out in microcosm at all levels of a complicated society, but there's a macroscopic splitting of society into a Manichaean conflict that is like fractal throughout all the layers of society. That's the same idea as intersectionality right here, second paragraph, Communist Manifesto. So the way that Delgado and Stefanchik finish that paragraph is, and so the dialectic progresses, is through going through all of these little fights and all the little places working their way up. And I've described that logic in a talk I gave a couple of years ago, As Below, So Above, that explains the Marxist dialectical magic, and I encourage you all to go listen to it. Marx and Engels get to the point here by going to the modern era. Those are historical and earlier epochs of history. Well, what about ours? He says the modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society. So there was a destruction of the feudal society through the same kind of revolution that he's saying characterizes all of history. And the modern bourgeois society arose from that. He says, well, the modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. So I want to call back a second. I know this isn't quite what I was talking about. You just hear that the fight has reconstituted in the present era, though. So one of the things I wanted to say earlier when I was comparing fascism as a reaction to communism, from which it is to which it is reacting, is Lenin's idea of what the socialist state represents. And we covered that in a couple of podcasts that I did about Lenin. I still should go back and do more podcasts about Lenin if I can remember where I left off. But Lenin says that the socialist state is a semi-state because there are two essential functions of the state, and the socialist state, according to Lenin, only does one of those two. And so that makes it half a state or a semi-state, right? So the two essential functions of a state, according to Lenin in State and Revolution, which he wrote in 1917, the year he took power, the two essential functions of the state are, number one, to preserve class conflict. In other words, to favor the oppressing class in society. And the socialist state does not continue that project because it favors the oppressed class by definition. And number two, it is to suppress the enemies of the state. And so Lenin, it does continue that one. Socialism does continue that one by, not because it wants to, its goal is to get past that, but by necessity. That's Lenin's argument. Marx believes this as well, and Engels believes this as well, because Lenin argues in State and Revolution that he got that concept from more Engels, but particularly Marx and Engels. Okay, so you have a state that is designed to preserve class conflict, and it's designed to suppress the enemies of the state, which is preserving class conflict. So that's how the state becomes an instrument of maintaining the class stratification and class antagonism at the heart of society. That's the Marxist theory of how the state works. When the socialists take over, Lenin contends, following Marx and Engels, they're going to abolish that. They're not going to favor the oppressor classes anymore. In fact, they're going to become them with the goal of ending that. And so they are going to only do the repressive function, setting up the dictatorship of the proletariat rather than a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or whatever else. And the dictatorship of the proletariat, because it's being done for the people, in the people, by the people, etc., which is all their big lie, now represents the oppressed classes, not the oppressor class. And so it's not reproducing, but ending class antagonism. That's the claim. The fascists, on the other hand, see the same idea. What does a state do? Well, it suppresses your enemies and it maintains class division and class struggle. But that's good. That's it. That's how you get from Marxism to fascism, right there. The Marxists say we're going to invert the program in order to allegedly end the program. The fascists say the program was working until you tried to invert it, so we're not going to let you, and we're going to double down and reinforce the program. So we're going to use a state. We're going to believe that the state's purpose is to, in fact, maintain the conflict of classes, which will solve any problems that come up with that differently. And as a matter of fact, its purpose is to suppress all enemies of the state and subjugate them. Whereas in free societies, we try not to have states subjugating anything. The Marxist lie is that there is no such thing as a free society. It's all just hiding this oppression. And the fascist lie is that the free society doesn't work because it actually just opens the door to the Marxists, and therefore we have to be very rigid in installing exactly what the state was for. In other words, the woke right is saying Lenin was right about how states actually work, except that he had the wrong solution. So we pick up the same ideas, same criticisms, but for different solutions. We're going to reinforce the state. We're going to reinforce the hierarchy. We're going to put it down in terms of duty. We're going to put it down in terms of the actual deserving members of the nation, whether that's political, ethnic, or cultural markers or something else, ideological markers that define whether or not you're part of the program. Whereas the communists say, no, that's what it is, but we're promised, like legit pinky swear, we're going to fix it. So Marx goes on with Engels, of course. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonism. So if you listen in the earlier era, right, what you heard was a proliferation. I'm not going to go through it all. In ancient Rome, he gives 4 categories: patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. We get to the Middle Ages when we've advanced to a properly, no longer a slave society, but now a feudal society. We have lords, vassals, guild masters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. So now you have 6. It's got more complicated. Well, he's actually saying our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, however, has a distinct feature. It simplifies class antagonism. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into 2 great hostile camps, into 2 great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the chartered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in commodities generally gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society a rapid development. So he's explaining how feudal society became what he calls bourgeois society here. The feudal system of industry in which industrial production was monopolized by the closed guilds no longer sufficed, for the growing wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system, so mercantilism falls apart for the manufacturing system that took its place. The guild masters were pushed on the one side by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacturer no longer sufficed, thereupon steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. So he's criticizing the impact, or remarking upon, actually he never remarks upon, he's criticizing the impact of the Industrial Revolution. The manufacturing system took its, sorry, I skipped in the wrong paragraph. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant modern industry, that is proper noun, capital letters. The place of the industrialized, or the industrial middle class, by industrial millionaires, the leaders of the whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world market for which the discovery of America paved the way. Why do you think they hate America so much? By the way, this market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in its turn, reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extended, in the same proportion the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. So far what he's trying to explain is, as the feudal society, so you have slave societies and feudal societies, then you end up in this bourgeois capitalist society. And as that happened, there was a massive contraction of the class society. Rather than having many classes layered throughout society where people knew their places, knew their roles, now you're having this, because of the powers of industrialization and mass production and communication and transport and travel, you suddenly have this huge division. There are these ultra-capitalists who are rapidly growing into millionaires. Remember, this is 1848, so what a millionaire represents is astronomical wealth. And then on the other hand, everything else where you could carve out kind of a middle existence is being crushed down into the proletariat. So a small percentage are rising up to become bourgeoisie, and a large percentage are being smashed down to be wage slaves. And so there's this is kind of his fate belief, that the conflict of history was getting more complex as history developed until it got to capitalism. Then it clarifies and simplifies. There are the people and there are the producers and rulers. And it's very clear who's in which class. There's not this vertically integrated society that can kind of diffuse the conflict. So there is going to be a massive revolution. Of course, this matches the Manichaean Gnostic structure that good and evil are shattered into the whole world, and the good is kind of distilling itself and clarifying itself in one place, whereas the evil is also, by virtue of the good retreating from it, clarifying, distilling itself into another, so that the great, some people pronounce it, maybe I pronounce it wrong, I say Manichaean, I think it's Manichaean. The great Manichaean struggle is going to come, the big conflict between good and evil, and of course the trick is, in the Manichaean Gnostic system, I'm going to try to train myself to say it the correct way now, live in this podcast, the Manichaean system is now going to have good triumph over evil in the great final cosmic battle that liberates all of humanity from the evil of the fallen material world. But anyway, I digress. They go on. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune, here an independent urban republic as in Italy and Germany, there taxable third estates of the monarchy as in France. Afterwards, so that's how the feudal system worked in various different ways, but afterwards, in the period of manufacturing proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility, and in fact cornerstone of the great monarchies in general, the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. Now, if you're keeping track, that was one sentence. So all these claims that Marx was a good writer, even with Engels helping him, is not really that true. The executive of the modern state, he says, is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. So we kind of get some insight based on that paragraph as to why he calls it the bourgeoisie. Why does he use a French term even when he is a German and he is writing in London? Why use the French term? And the reason that they use the French term is because the French Revolution is the model. That's why. This whole thing, I'm not going to go into it, is based off of the motif. What he had to have had in mind was the French Revolution. He mentions, of course, the Third Estate and the monarchy in France, but afterwards he says, in the period of manufacturing proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility. That's the French Revolution structure, which he's generalizing. And in fact, the cornerstone of the great monarchies in general, the bourgeoisie, which was in effect the kind of bad guy, if you will, has since the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself exclusive political sway. So that now you don't have leaders or monarchs or whatever else, the executive of the modern state. So all of James Burnham's 1940s great stuff that the managerial revolution that the woke right has used to create their own Marxist theory of society with the managerial class as bourgeoisie is all predicated in this paragraph, in this sentence. It's all here already. It's just Marx again. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. That's the managerial class predicted right there. It's like they're just repackaging the same turd and thinking that they've got something cool and original. But of course, the woke right's whole mantra is what? Marx had the right analysis, but the wrong solutions because they have the fascist tack rather than, they call it traditionalist, but they're not. They have the fascist tact as opposed to the communist tact. The bourgeoisie historically, Marx and Engels tell us, has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his, quote, natural superiors. So natural superiors here is in scare quotes because Marx didn't believe, he being a radical egalitarian communist, didn't believe there were natural superiors, but he's basically making the argument kind of from fascism with a little tongue-in-cheek that or even from monarchism, that there are natural superiors and the hierarchy created by the natural superiors, or elite theory in more modern parlance, that the hierarchy created through that made society work. But he's saying the bourgeoisie actually bulldozed that. So in place of bourgeoisie, you could say liberals or capitalists, right? It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties, our traditionalist, distributist societal structure that heritage Americans truly grew up in, that bound man to his, quote, natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest. Oh, it's atomized man. It's created the atomized individual who must act as fungible economic units acting in their own individual self-interest. And he clarifies that that's really what he means by saying, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. And that's also in scare quotes. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of, by the way, if you don't know why, we're now in the body of the part that Marcus Carlson, meaning me, sent to the American Reformer as a hoax. And if you can't figure out why they published this, if you're at all familiar with the way the woke right talk or think, if you've watched any other videos or read any other articles, actually what was happening in October when I wrote that hoax for American Reformer was I was reading the Communist Manifesto on a flight to Alaska, and I got to this part and I was like, oh my God, it's just going to come off the page. The hoax is here. And then I completely diverted and never made this podcast that I'm making today. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor. So it's the bourgeoisie has killed off religion. Of chivalrous enthusiasm, so men can't be men. Of Philistine sentimentalism, so we can't have like emotional ties to stuff because everything's atomic and fungible and economic units. These are all woke right arguments, by the way, that I'm making in the parentheses. In the icy water of egotistical calculation, it has resolved personal worth into exchange value. Which woke right person do you want to give you that argument, by the way? and in place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. I mean, it's painfully obvious why I wrote this hoax, isn't it? In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie, meaning what? Liberalism and capitalism. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. Again, I read this and I'm thinking, my goodness, that's what the woke right says. We used to respect people, and now you're just, a corporate cog in a corporate machine, fungible economic unit. That's what they always say. Fungible, of course, means interchangeable. It has, the bourgeoisie, meaning liberalism and capitalism. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. They're not quite that serious on the woke right. They are about the various jobs. You'll hear them very frequently complain, not completely wrongly, that there are very few physicians in private practice. They're all getting scooped up by corporate conglomerations. A lot of that's being achieved through legal manipulation, blah, blah, blah. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass. Make sure I get that right. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionaries so much admire. Yes, they do. Don't they? Deus Vult with their crusader icons on Twitter. They use those less now that they kind of got called out, right? The bourgeoisie has now disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionaries so much admire, as did Hitler, very clearly, by the way, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses, capitalized, of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production. Let's come back to that. I want to make another point about the relationship between communism and fascism that I should have earlier. It just occurred to me as I was reading this Middle Ages thing. So you do have kind of Hitler reaching back into the Middle Ages to this mythical Anglo-Saxon society in Germany with Nordic influence that he's going to try to recreate. It creates this mythology of old Germany that he's got to bring back. But Mussolini is kind of the more interesting character here. Of course, you have Franco appealing to this kind of lost Catholicism that bound all of Spain, even though at the time Spain was a Spain of three cultures from its massive Moorish, not necessarily to complement the Islam influence there, but there was this weird confluence of Protestant Catholic and of Muslim in Spain, with actually some significant Jewish influence as well. And it was considered the Iberian Peninsula in general was kind of considered to be this like three cultures place at the same time. And, Franco was going to bring it back to its Catholic roots by looking back to roughly, when the Catholics were so-called cleaning house, which would be roughly around the Inquisition. He was going to unify Spain around that. But Mussolini is the interesting character here. And the interesting character for Mussolini was that he wasn't looking back to the Middle Ages. He was looking back before that. His goal with Italian fascism actually looked back to the Roman system, which was the even earlier system, and was going to recreate the glories of Rome in a new modern industrial form. And that's really part of what his fascism was about. So in a sense of, it's not just the brutal display of vigor of the Middle Ages, it was also the brutal display of vigor of late antiquity as well, at least for Mussolini. But I digress. This is an important part. He says the bourgeoisie, and this is what the woke right and the woke left both say, but especially the woke right, who's trying to react to the dissolving. They claim that liberalism is in essence communism on its way, or the midwife of communism, because it is its own dissolving acid. Nothing can survive. You see this argument all the time. Yoram Hazony makes this argument in Conservatism Rediscovery, and then the introduction is that classical liberalism, I wish I had it in front of me, classical liberalism conserves nothing. And in fact, it is just able to dissolve, and the main thing it dissolves is conservatism. So same argument here. The bourgeoisie, which is classical liberalism and capitalism, and I'll point out that Yoram Hazony in Conservatism Rediscovery has a very long discussion where Yoram Hazony, by the way, is the head of the Edmund Burke Institute, which is sort of hilariously ironic, but he's also I don't know if it's CEO, but he's in charge of the National Conservatism, or NatCon movement, which is this woke right, professional buttoned-up rogue element that is trying to transform conservatism according to his rediscovered vision. Well, that book has a long digression on how Marx had the right analysis of liberalism and capitalism, but the wrong solutions. Very long discussion of that, given it's a book about conservatism. Very flattering discussion, but of course they never said that Marx was great because he had the wrong solutions, right? But his argument is literally, and I don't mean his argument, the thesis statement of Yoram Hazony's book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery, which is the basis for the national conservatism movement that he runs, is that classical liberalism cannot conserve anything. It is a dissolving acid that especially dissolves conservatism. It's a few pages into the introduction. The bourgeoisie, which is to say liberalism and capitalism, cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Same exact argument in the Communist Manifesto from Karl Marx, and you wouldn't find Yoram Hazony denying it, just like American Reformer didn't deny it when they got hoaxed, because what they will say is right analysis, wrong conclusion. I'm telling you. Why do I call them woke right? I don't know. Conservation of listen to this. Conservation of the old modes of production in unadulterated form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguished the bourgeois, that is liberal and capitalist, epoch from all earlier ones. This is the same fundamental thesis statement that Hazony makes in Conservatism or Rediscovery, but it's also the fundamental basis upon which Marx launches his project. All fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable practice. I screwed this up completely. All fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. If you took out his real conditions of life out of that paragraph, literally just that, you couldn't tell. I could and maybe the word bourgeoisie, and replaced it with classical liberalism and free market capitalism if you want. You would not be able to tell the difference between that and the arguments in Conservatism or Rediscovery that are not his historical arguments. Same argument, same view. And that, for Marx, is the problem. That's his analysis of liberal and capitalist society that the woke right agrees is correct, but with the wrong solutions. He goes on, he says, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. National conservatism thinks the same thing. We should be retracting into our nations instead. Marx and Engels say it must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie, that's the same argument that Hazony makes, by the way. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. Same argument Hazony makes. To the great chagrin of reactionists, it has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. Same argument Hazony and the rest of the national conservatives and the woke right make. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. Same argument. They are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations. Same argument. By industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Same argument. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. Same argument. Hence all the isolationism. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants requiring for their satisfaction the products of distant lands and climes. Same argument. Same argument. Curtis Yarvin once told me in Face to Face in January of 2021, woke right monarchy lunatic, this exact same idea. His solution that would never come about, but would be a great radical solution for some problem or another that he was complaining about that had something to do with global trade, was to cut off every country, give it its own unique in-house internet so that there was no communication for a century between countries, so that each could develop internally according to its own national characters. And then we'd go back to having real diversity, real interest in real because of difference in real innovation and progress in the world again if we opened things back up after a century. Same. Marx is making the same critique of classical liberalism and capitalism that the woke right uses their starting point. Same arguments, slightly different conclusions, which I've already characterized for you. In place, he says, of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. So why is the woke right so isolationist? For the same reason that Marx was arguing that isolationism characterized an earlier epoch. Remember that Marx wants to take what's happening and advance it into international socialism, but the reactionaries are like, oh my God, it's so bad now, we need to go back to those conditions and enforce them artificially. As Marx goes on, or so does Engels, I guess, and as in material, so also in intellectual production, the intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. This is kind of what Yarvin was talking to me about in that very weird discussion. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous national and local literatures there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communications, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. So that's the liberalizing project that they're afraid of. This is why they criticize, for example, the Chinese wearing business suits. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls. Kind of funny now, right? And that's exactly the other direction. With which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, that is, to become bourgeois themselves. In one world, it creates a world after its own image. And so this, by the way, is the invocation of the demiurge nature of bourgeois society that characterize it as a socio-gnostic program. I'm just saying, creates a world after its own image. That's the literal idea behind the demiurge. But anyway, this is, again, the exact same argument the woke right makes. Again, they say it for a reason. Marx's analysis of liberalism, they say, was correct. It was just that his conclusions were wrong. This is not a good way to think, guys. Because to get here, you have to have onboarded that entire trajectory of history thing that makes you woke in the first place. The bourgeoisie, they tell us, has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. So in other words, the cities are, this is a rural-urban argument to understand what the country means. Country means countryside, right? I'll say it that way instead. The bourgeoisie has subjected the countryside to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the towns, so the countryside dependent on the towns, so it has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones, nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois. The East and the West. So again, we see the woke right isolationism, do we not? By following this argument against bourgeois society, which is to say liberal, classically liberal and capitalist society, which they agree with. The bourgeoisie, they continue, keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated population, centralized the means of production, and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. Okay, now here's where there's a split between woke left and woke right, because the woke right sees this and they think, oh my God, the solution to this massive agglomeration, I guess is what he uses the word, of power, money, capital, and so on, means of production in one place, has to be fixed through an economic doctrine called distributism, where it's supposed to be an ideal that people do voluntarily, but in reality the state will have to implement it. We'll have to distribute the means of production as far down the chain of production as possible. And as possible there is doing all the work. The woke right is therefore distributist and anti-capitalist and anti-liberal. They call it post-liberalism, distributism, and integralism. On the Marxist side, the socialist side or the left, Marx sees this as an opportunity. Okay, so you already have everything in one place. You have a de facto dictatorship of the very small, basically of the oligarchy. You have you already have the structure, all of a dictatorship of the proletariat. If only you could transfer ownership from the, and this is very important for the rest of this document, by the way, if only you could transfer ownership from the hands of a very few small number of capitalists, if you could transfer that mass ownership to the very small number of hands of the Communist Party, which will then act on behalf of the people. Actually, let me do the argument right. So he sees this opportunity here, and the opportunity is that you've already concentrated almost all the power and wealth into a very small number of hands. Well, if you could somehow transfer the ownership from private interest to the public, to the people, then you would have the socialist society already there. So the capitalist society he sees as having collapsed the complicated class structure of feudalism into a very simple dichotomy. That very simple dichotomy is ready to have its revolution, by which the same exact structure is maintained, but ownership is reversed. So now you don't have a small number of capitalists owning it, you have owning all of the means of production, as capitalism tends toward a giant global monopoly. Instead, what you have is the ability for the entire population to own the means of production that they all work for. But of course, that's not going to work, because you can't have 90% of the population own everything. So you need to have some kind of an object that's going to facilitate and organize that, and that's going to be the Communist Party. So you're going to transfer all ownership from a small number of corporate leaders who at the time were trending toward monopoly and trust, which, by the way, we figured out how to defeat without communism or without distributism. Antitrust law is like the very, very, very limited amount of very interesting developments in the early 20th century. Antitrust law is the very limited application of distributism that keeps a free market society working so that it can't kill itself through monopoly and corporate trust. And then, on the other hand, social safety nets, whatever you think of them, actually solve the problem of abject poverty in a way that takes away the ability for the kind of Marxist revolution that is on the other side, plus worker protections getting encoded into law, which, by the way, disempower unions and make them less necessary. I'm just saying. So anyway, a little bit of socialist thought for how to deal with the big problems of unregulated capitalism, a little bit of distributist thought. It's not that they're totally wrong. They're partly right, but mostly wrong, because all you need is a little bit of each to make the free market system actually maintain its free market status and to work, as opposed to flipping all the way into these systems. But Marx sees this as an opportunity. So the Communist Party is going to replace the capitalists who already own everything. So then the Communist Party is going to control everything, but they're doing it in the name of the people. So in a sense, the people theoretically own everything, and then eventually they will own everything, and then you're going to have communism. So this is two roads diverge in a yellow wood at this point for the woke left and woke right. The bourgeoisie, they tell us, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. So somehow we had to remember in the EPM, Marx says that the point of communism is a transcendent instead of a crude form, is going to retain the production of all earlier epochs of history. So this is a production. This is the stuff he covets. This is your primitives made to live in cities, dialectical synthesis that's at the heart of the whole, whether it's Rousseau, whether it's French Revolution, whether it's Schiller, whether it's Hegel, whether it's Marx project, all manifesting in different ways. So they have the bourgeoisie has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all the preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of the rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? We see then the means of production and of exchange on whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up were generated in feudal society. So they're claiming that the bourgeois stole what was rightfully the feudal society. So there's your woke right, by the way, alienation myth. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in one word, the feudal relations of property, became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. So history is a series. This is a Hermetic, not purely Gnostic reading. History is progressing through a series of kind of like breakout moments. You have these means of production, modes of production, whether it's slave, whether it's feudal, whether it's capitalist, whatever. And those are like layers in which humanity is progressing but is locked and trapped. And so you have to find a point where the contradictions build up so great that you can't continue. The productive forces get so great that you can no longer continue in the current mode, and you break free of them and go into the next. Otherwise, if you don't do that at the right moment, that mode of production starts producing either a prison for society, fetters, or it starts to produce false needs in a different kind of prison, where that's what the critical theorists were taking up, was the idea that society is producing false needs to justify continuing to have a not socialist society. But the idea is that you have these, like, literally, if you look at the Corpus Hermeticum, astral planes or whatever, these planes of existence, and you have to break from the first to the second to the third to the fourth to the fifth to the sixth to the seventh, and finally you might progress to the eighth, which is, by the way, what they call Christ consciousness in the New Age. It's achieving mind of God, or nous, in the Corpus Hermeticum, at which point then you can rejoin the whole. Marx's idea of history is the same thing. He just believes that each of these stages has made it more and more and more clear what was going to be burst asunder. So anyway, here's the Hermeticism. That was the point. Into their place, that means in the place of the feudal relations, which were fetters once the productive modes of machinery and industry and the bourgeois liberal program in 100 years had come into being. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted in it, and the economic and political sway of the bourgeois class. So that's how the bourgeoisie took over. A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. So this is also what I just said is why for the opposite reason, why the woke right hates liberalism and capitalism. They want to go back to those older and simpler modes, which are kind of impossible. So they're going to create them in pastiche artificially and enforce them through a rigid hierarchical society that they're, what a surprise, going to be the top of. A similar movement, they tell us, is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many a decade past the history of industry and commerce, that is a weird phrasing. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of the bourgeois and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crisis that by their periodical return, did I have that right? It is enough to mention the commercial crises, there it was, that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeois society on its trial, each time more threateningly. In these crises, a great part of not only the existing products, but also the previously creative productive forces are periodically destroyed. So this is the theory of creative destruction that the woke right is asking, can we really continue to do this? And here it is Karl Marx saying that it is threatening even the bourgeois mode. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence, industry, and commerce seems to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered. And so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. So what he's saying is, okay, at some point the productive forces in late feudal society exceeded the capacity for feudal society to keep up. So boom, they burst asunder and bourgeois powers took over. But those same kinds of crises of too much production are now plaguing bourgeois society and causing crises and crisis shocks. And those crisis shocks that are rattling society are actually an indication from Marx's perspective that what we need to do is burst free of the fetters of capitalism itself. And I told you how. He believes that the social means of production already exist. They're located in the capital owners, which is a small number of kind of oligarchical, monopolistic trust kind of people, and that ownership has to be transferred to the people. That can only be done in the name of the stakeholder group, which is the socialists or the communists, and that's what the second chapter of this thing is going to be about. And the woke right has a similar but different analysis. They see the same crisis shocks, and what they see that has as proof that the whole system of capitalism and liberalism can't work. Rather than figuring out ways to adjust to these shocks and move forward and solve the problems, it's just not going to work. We need to abandon it. We need to adopt full-blown distributism, and we need to get back to a simpler way of life where we have a lot less, to get away from this overproduction, which is one of their big problems. So both woke left and woke right support degrowth, as it turns out, as their model. We need to get back to a simpler mode. We need to get away from these false needs, and thus we need to end the cycle of these crisis shocks, because they're actually ultimately super pessimistic doomers who don't know how to deal with the fact that things get challenging, bad stuff happens, and then human beings figure out solutions to those things and continue to do well by each other with what appears to be a continually growing economy or status of wealth as measured in quality of life and capacity to solve problems. Like, for instance, how many people die when a hurricane comes. Super doomers. But we see the same program happening here. So here, Marx gets poetic with Engels. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. That's economic production, by the way, are the weapons. But not only has the bourgeoisie forced the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield these weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. So for the Marxist left, it is the woke left, it is the proletarian class. And for the woke right, it is going to be the heritage people who were displaced, who are going to go back to that simpler way of life and benefit from it by excluding everybody else. Okay, so again, the roads diverge in a yellow wood here. But again, I just want to summarize Marx's view of the opportunity of the crisis shock situation of overproduction in the bourgeois society that's at the heart of his argument, which is he's saying basically that humanity is ready to burst through from the sacred plane of capitalist organization of society into the next one. And what he sees is that actually we already have socialist production. We already have the idea of massive social production organized under the corporation. The corporation is just owned incorrectly. All of the people working for the corporation should own the corporation rather than a handful of owners. So for him, if we could just have this massive transfer of ownership, there'd be no problem. But what he articulates in a lot of his other writing is but Lenin really articulates this, is that the bourgeoisie aren't going to give it up. These rich capitalists aren't just going to give over their ownership to everybody, say, okay, guys, you're right. Time to go to the next phase of production society. That's why socialism, by the way, that's why the Soviets and the Maoists and the People's Republic of China were so hell-bent on raising production standards, more steel, more grain, more dams, more power over nature. They were so convinced that socialism is a breaking free of the limits of the productive modes of capitalism, that it would be able to outcompete capitalism in terms of production, which of course never worked. That's what the current CCP in China is trying to do with its hybrid stakeholder model that has incorporated the Nazi Shareholder Act from 1937 into their economic policy. They do not have free markets. They have a fascist market that operates with the CCP in place of the fascist party. But they're trying to prove to the world that they can outproduce everything, and thus that they have a model that has broken free and moved to the next. Free markets, liberalism and capitalism are over. There's a more productive next stage of humanity that we all must move to. That is literally the program that they're all of the bad guys, CCP, United Nations, World Economic Forum, woke left, woke right, Marxism, fascism, that's what they're all pointing toward, and they're all doing experiments and have been doing experiments for over a century, almost 2 centuries, as to how to make that happen. Okay? And so what Marx is now saying is that this productive capacity itself has forged weapons that will overthrow them, and what has forged the weapon in is the people who are going to wield it. The productive forces themselves are in the workers. So he says, not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, but it also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, that is capital, see, he literally means bourgeoisie equals capital and liberalism. In proportion as the bourgeoisie is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed. So as you create factories, you create workers. A class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. A great deal of the economic and philosophic manuscripts from 4 years earlier are actually about this. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence he requires for maintenance and for the propagation of his race, but for the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more. In proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by the increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by the increased speed of machinery, etc. We're having a similar argument about AI right now. But I'll just point out that without talking about AI and the situation of our own era, what he's saying is that, basically work just gets worse and worse and worse as it gets more and more industrial. You get more and more repetitive factory jobs. The only things left are things to do that are really degrading, maybe like shoveling sewage or whatever else, and they pay you as little as possible. And as things get more and more mechanized, they can pay you less and less and less per unit of work or time or whatever else. And so naturally capitalism is going to immiserate and destroy the worker. But what we discovered, and what Herbert Marcuse complained about throughout the entirety of his tenure as a critical Marxist in the 20th century, is that advanced capitalism, as Marcuse called it, solved this problem by literally, whether you want to credit the labor movement, which was largely socialist or not, the labor movement was a huge bid to try to push socialist ideas. And what it worked out was a compromise where the capitalist society was like, 8-hour working days, 5 days a week, 40 hours, you have to pay overtime. There's going to be worker protections. We're going to have some regulations. We're going to protect all this thing, blah, blah, blah. Even minimum wage. I know that one's a little more controversial. In other words, there were other solutions to the problem other than flipping the table and going into a socialist program led by communists. And it turns out that we did grand experiments and have seen that worked. Modern industry, Marx and Engels tell us, has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Same thing the woke right would argue. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. This, by the way, became his model for how the dictatorship of the proletariat would work, just to point that out. The less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working classes. Sounds exactly like the woke right, by the way. All instruments of labor more or less expensive to instruments of labor more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the laborer by the manufacturer so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash than he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. The lower strata of the middle classes, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and the peasants, All these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on and is swamped in competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production. The proletariat thus is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development, he then tells us. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. So the struggle is actually literally the defining characteristic of the proletariat as working class. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the work people of a factory, then by the operative of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze, and they seek to restore by force the vanished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages. So the reactionaries flip out about the means of production, so they target the wrong thing, Marx is saying in Engels. Rather than targeting the system, they target the pieces of the system, the things that are actually in their faces. So that's reactionary rather than taking the road of smashing the whole system, according to Marx. At this stage, he says, the laborers still form an incoherent mass scattered over the whole country and broken up by their mutual competition. If anywhere they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own act of union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, and is, moreover yet, for a time able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies, the remnants of the absolute monarchy, the landowners, the non-industrial bourgeois, the petty bourgeois. Thus, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie. So the workers lash out at the wrong targets. They lash out at those backwards rather than the ones that are actually enslaving them, thus concentrating the power of their enslavers, is the argument. But, he says, with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses, its strength grows, it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized, as everybody's life gets worse, by the way. In proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. See, it's the processes of capital smash everybody down into the same low level of crap, except the super rich capitalists. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating. Their increasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. So they start to see themselves in terms of the class struggle that Marx says they've been missing up to this point. Thereupon, they say, the workers begin to form combination, trades unions, against the bourgeois. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. So they're still trying to do the wrong thing. They found permanent associations in order to make provision beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry, and that place the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles, all of the same character, into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle. Where have you heard that kind of thing before, right? And that union to attain which the burghers of the Middle Ages with their miserable highways required centuries, the modern proletarian, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years. This organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves, but it ever rises up again stronger, firmer, mightier. It compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. Thus, the 10 Hours Bill in England was carried. So he's laying out how the bourgeoisie forces the proletariat to increasingly become a class-conscious class that works as a class instead of a bunch of exploited individuals, thus realizing the class conflict nature that they find themselves in, thus readying them for revolution. Altogether, he says, collisions between the classes of the old society further in many ways the course of development of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, at all time with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat to ask for help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariats with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. So they equip the proletariat, they educate the proletariat, they raise them up, trying to make them more like the bourgeoisie, but actually they give them the tools necessary to fight back by becoming competent enough to be organized against the bourgeoisie. Further, they tell us, as we have already seen, entire sections of the ruling class are by the advance of industry precipitated into the proletariat, or are at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the progress of disillusion going on within the ruling class, in fact within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. So eventually this split gets so pronounced that the lower class is ready to revolt, and a segment of the upper class, namely it's going to be the Communist Party, carves itself off to lead them. But the reason is because they actually see their opportunity as they see their opportunity to lead a revolutionary force and thus take over. So I know this is on one of my paywalled podcasts, but for those of you that listen to my recent James Lindsay Only Subs paywalled podcast about Curtis Yarvin and Dark Elves, you'll notice that this is the same exact argument that he makes, just to point out that the woke right is very invested in Marxist analysis and Marxist activism. Just as, therefore, they tell us, at an earlier period, the section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular a portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. So again, what he's saying is there are bastard opportunists who see that there's about to be a big conflict, and they abandon the bourgeois interest while retaining their bourgeois status to go lead the revolution so that they will be the people in charge when the revolution ends. And that's the real purpose of the Communist Party, thus the real purpose of the Manifesto of the Communist Party that we're reading from. And chapter 2 tells us it's the communists who are going to be the ones who are going to do this. But they're also therefore confessing that they're actually bourgeois elements, and it turns out that they're actually just using the proletariat. So again, to reference the paywalled episode that I did about Curtis Yarvin and his dark elves, he says that there are elves and there are hobbits, but there are actually dark elves who wish they could break free and take over the high elves, but they can't. So they make common cause with the hobbits, that's the proletariat, and then they overthrow the current high elves and have a new regime. And allegedly, that's supposed to be good for the hobbits somehow. Of all the classes, Marx and Engels tell us, that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary but conservative. Nay, more, they are reactionary. For they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance, the wheel of history only goes in one direction, by the way. That's why you're going to be on the right side of history or the wrong side of history, and that's why the small private shopkeeper is on the wrong side. The petite bourgeoisie is on the wrong side of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are only so in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. The dangerous class, they explain, the lumpenproletariat, the social scum, that passively rotted mass thrown off by the lowest layers of the old society, may here and there be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. In the condition of the proletariat, those of old society at large are already virtually swamped. The proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeois family relations. Modern industry, labor, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. Again, we have the same analysis with the splitting of directions between woke left, which we just heard, and woke right. For woke left, we're going to get beyond all of those bourgeois things like family and nation. For woke right, we're going to go back to them in order to try to force a different situation. But since the wheel of history can't move backwards, analysis is right, but solutions are wrong, we're going to set up an artificial enforced hierarchy that mandates them. That's the woke right solution, which is not a solution. All the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. So they have to destroy all individual property in order to move forward because they don't really have any. They've been tricked into thinking they have a little, but they have nothing. So the goal is to destroy it all, and that's how they're going to advance the revolution. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities. Marx and Engels explain, or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. So now we're not having a revolution to make things better for some minority that wants to take power. We're having a revolution for the vast majority who are going to be set free. He says, though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first settle all matters with its own bourgeoisie. In depicting the most general phases, this is how the dialectic progresses, by the way. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we traced the more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society up to the point where the war breaks out into open revolution and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can at least continue its slavish existence. The serf in the period of serfdom raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois under the yoke of feudal absolutism managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the process of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. Again, turned out there were solutions to this, and the entire field of cultural and critical Marxism had to come into existence to try to deal with those solutions without having to have a Marxist revolution. But what he's arguing is that there must be some kind of conditions that you throw the lower classes to keep things going. This is why you hear woke left and woke right sometimes make arguments that people were better off under slavery, because they were given things like housing and food that allowed them to keep doing what they were doing. Whereas Marx is making the argument that the modern laborer, instead of rising with the process, just sinks deeper and deeper below. He becomes a pauper, Marx and Engels tell us, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. See, I told you. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence no longer compatible with society. The essential conditions for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by the revolutionary combination due to association. The development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Okay, so that wraps up chapter 1. Chapter 2 is shorter. Proletarians and communists. We've now heard, though, that the bourgeoisie produces the proletariat. The purpose of the proletariat will be to be the revolutionaries that break free of the fetters of that form of existence. I kind of explained what the point is, but as we heard, it's going to be that the proletarians are not actually able to run everything for themselves, so that portion that breaks off from the bourgeoisie to join them is going to become a vanguard, as Lenin described it, that being the Bolshevik project that is going to run everything for them. The Communist Party is going to be the section of the bourgeoisie that is enlightened enough to lead the proletariat through the revolution that it's supposed to have. And then, since that's a protracted revolution of the transformation of society from capitalism through socialism eventually to communism, they, of course, are going to have to rule. So this is all a manifesto for a power transfer to a section of the bourgeoisie, in fact, the most parasitical section of the bourgeoisie, the envious, coveting, resentful section of the bourgeoisie. They are going to stoke up the agitation of the working class and then in their name lead them into a revolution because they need their force and their power. And then this parasitical bourgeois class is going to take over the power. That's what this document is actually about, and rule society allegedly in the name of the bourgeoisie, but as we know from history, into nothing but destruction. Chapter 2 explains how this part works, that splinter off of the entitled parasitical part, aka the communists, are the entitled, resentful, parasitical, covetous, jealous, envious splinter of the bourgeoisie that's going to lead the proletarians. And this is what this chapter is about. 2. Proletarians and communists. Of course, I explained that at the very beginning, too. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. Lie, lie, Two lies. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. A third lie. Three lies right off the bat. The communists, they tell us, are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. One, in the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. So they internationalize the struggle. And two, in the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, which is going to be protracted, by the way, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. So they're going to be the representatives of the whole communist or proletarian movement. That means they're going to be in charge. That means they're going to get all the power. That means they're going to be using the proletariat, by the way. So the CRT people are using people of color, in particular BIPOC. The queer theorists are using LGBT. The feminists are using women. And we can just go right down the line of the entire intersectional program. The communists, therefore, they say, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. So they are going to be the leaders, but they also are the most advanced section, or the socio-gnostic elect. The immediate aim, they say, of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. So the Communist Party is going to have conquest of political power by the proletariat, but they're going to lead it. It's a power grab for the envious, parasitical branch in the bourgeoisie that sees its opportunity as just described in Chapter 1. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express, that's a lie, by the way, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle. That's why you can't pick up Marxism as just analysis and tools, because it doesn't see itself as analysis and tools. It sees itself as actually seeing the world through its lens. It is a world view that tools and analysis come from. The worldview comes first. They don't even listen to this. They don't even think that they have like their own unique worldview, like way of doing things. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. Of course they do, though. They just don't believe it about themselves because they think they figured out the real working of history and society and people. They merely express, they tell us, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle. So class struggle defines society. It also defines who you are, your positionality in the class struggle defines your person and your character. From a historical movement going on under our very eyes, the abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. Well, no, the distributists like it too. All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products. That is, based on class antagonisms on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. So that's a very important sentence. In this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property, where they just explain that what they mean by private property is bourgeois private property, which is produced by the bourgeois means of production, which are all forms of private property in which it facilitates the production or use of wage laborers. Let me actually elaborate more. What's really at the heart of this, as I've talked about in other places, what's really at the heart of this is the fundamental right to exclude. That's what makes private property actually bourgeois. That you have the fundamental right to exclude people from the property that you produce. But it's not just that. It's also that because they're not necessarily against the feudal property, right? It doesn't matter because that's gone, so he can make that argument and make himself look good. But what they're actually against is any socially produced anything. So anything is produced, if you make it yourself, it's probably fine. However, and this is not what happened in practice for the communists, but this is the argument. If you make it yourself, it's probably fine, but if it was made in a factory, it's probably not, right? And so that's what has to be abolished, the ability for other people to do work, so you to hire people to help you. The ability for other people to do work, and then you own the product. We communists, he says, have been reproached with the desire, this is where it gets exciting, by the way, that important part about abolish private property, which ultimately means abolish the fundamental right to exclude one from another, or property from any other, because that ends in the capitalist means of production. This part now, that part marks a turning point. This part gets exciting. This is like the confession part, right? We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring private property as the fruit of man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There's no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. So that's what I just said. They can pretend they care, that they don't mind what you produce on your own, but they're saying because of industry, nobody does it anyway. It's already dead. Or do you mean the modern bourgeois private property? That's what they ask. But does wage labor create any property for the labor? Not a bit. So that's where if you work for somebody else, you're making something and they get to own it, right? Does wage labor create any property for the labor? Not a bit. Not a bit. That's not true. You get paid for your time to produce the thing. So you get money representing the capacity to go get your own private property in the system. But you don't take home, if you work at the Coca-Cola factory, you don't make Coca-Cola and take home Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola pays you to make Coca-Cola that they then sell to other people for a profit. It creates capital, they say. Does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital. That is that kind of property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. To be a capitalist, they say, is to have not only purely personal, but a social status in production. So they don't care just about property, they care about social status. It's very important. Actual equality or equity is not just located in economic forced equality. They're going to be socially equal in every way too. Equity goes all the way back to the Communist Manifesto. It doesn't just come from Soviet Union, and it doesn't just arise in the last 5 years or so with the woke movement, or in 1968 with the social equity program and administration. Capital, he says, is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members in society can it be set in motion. So what he's saying is, capitalism actually is already socialist, but it doesn't allow for the socialist distribution. It only allows for the capitalist distribution, where the capitalists themselves, the owners, get the most benefit. Capital, he says, is therefore not only personal, it is social power. When therefore capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. But now let us take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage. That is that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What, therefore, the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it. So it's fine that people make money to work, but what the system is that they want to destroy is that they get paid barely enough, only enough so that they can keep working, so that their entire existence gets reduced to working for the man, to make the man money, and the man gives him just enough stuff to keep him working so that it stays on the treadmill forever. That's what he's claiming is how it works. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. That's a fancy little sales pitch. In bourgeois society, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. That's ominous. I think that's in 1984 too. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom, and rightly so. There it is. And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom, and rightly so, says Marx and Engels, and rightly so agrees, as it turns out, the woke right. They like his analysis, just not his solutions, but maybe half of his solutions. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. So there the communists are finally very clear. They're going to get rid of bourgeois. By putting the word bourgeois in front of it, they can make it okay, right? Individuality, independence, and freedom. Of course, the woke right hate whatever they mean by bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom. You're supposed to be part of a community. You're not supposed to be independent, but interdependent. And you're not supposed to have freedom because you might use it wrong. You have duty instead. That's the woke right view. But it's the woke left view too. You can't have freedom. You have to have duty to the socialist program rather than duty to the pastiche traditionalist program. By freedom is meant, so what are they getting rid of? By freedom is meant, under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling, and buying. That's what you're not going to be free to do. There will be no more bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling, free buying. So you're only going to buy and sell and produce according to or trade what you're told to for the greater good or the common good if it's the woke right. But if selling and buying disappears, they say, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying and all other brave words of our bourgeois about freedom in general have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with restricted selling and buying with the fettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communistic abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeois conditions of production, and of the bourgeoisie itself. The next paragraph's a doozy, but let me unpack, because again, we got this woke left, woke right thing. So what they're saying is, well, there's this huge problem, and everybody in the feudal era would have known it, between this free selling and free buying, or whatever, freedom in general. And so what we had in the feudal era was restricted buying and selling, and so the woke right are like, yep, let's go back to that, because that made it work. And what the communists say is, oh, hell no, we're just going to get rid of buying and selling entirely. There just won't be any. And you're supposed to figure out how that society is going to work, right? But Marx in 1852 wrote down, is that when he wrote it down? From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. I can't remember if that, no, that wasn't until the 1870s in the Civil War in France, I think. I can't remember which piece that's in. But anyway, now we get to some juicy stuff. You are horrified, they write. Yes, we are. Marx, yes we are. Engels, we are horrified. You are horrified, they say, at our intending to do away with private property. So everything before that doesn't matter. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, private property has already done away with for 9/10 of the population. So there's your envy. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. So they couldn't have made that clearer, could they? From the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent, into a social power capable of being monopolized, that is, from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment, you say, individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by, quote, individual, you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle-class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. So, see you later, individualism. Communism, he says, deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriations. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. Yep, and it turns out to be kind of the thing. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness. For those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. So this really misunderstands, because he's in that parasitical faction of the bourgeoisie that doesn't understand how anything works, doesn't understand the taking and management of risk, the organizing of people, the vision required to build something and to mobilize people and to motivate them to bring it into the being. It's a very difficult thing that the bourgeois do in many cases, although I get it. Like, there's a lot of kind of idiots in the bourgeois classes that don't really seem to do anything. Like me, podcasting. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology that there can be no longer any wage laborer when there is no longer any capital. All objections used against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating material products have in the same way been urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating intellectual products. Just as to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is for the enormous majority a mere training to act as a machine. So here is, we have all this great stuff in society and we're all going to lose it if we go communist. But guess what? Because not everybody has it. Some people don't have great access to it, and what they have is not so good. Nobody can have it. It's it's this doctrine of envy and of resentment very, very, very clearly. That culture, the loss of which he laments, I already put that part, sorry. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois private property, the standard of your bourgeois notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. So in other words, don't stick us with your understanding of things. We have a completely different understanding of things. This is why every time somebody's ever disagreed with the communists by saying, holy crap, your thing doesn't work, they say you have bourgeois values. Your very ideas, he says, are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform them into the selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, which are historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production. This misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. what you see clearly in the case of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are, of course, forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. So are you kind of following him here? If you disagree with the communist view, the communist analysis, it's because you have bourgeois values. And those bourgeois values are a product of the property relations that you live within, that you benefit from, that you enjoy, so you won't give them up. Abolition, and it has the German word here, Aufhebung. Abolition, Aufhebung, that's Aufheben. That's the other grammatical form of Aufheben. So that's to keep, to abolish, and to lift up to a higher level of understanding. That's the dialectical synthesis. So abolition of the family, they write. Even the most radical flare-up, sorry, let me phrase it more accurately. Even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists, on what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital. So he's admitted in the Communist Manifesto. Where does the communists ever say they want to abolish the family? Literally in the Communist Manifesto. Abolition of the family, exclamation mark. Even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists. So they argue, on what foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private gain. Oh, of course. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie, but this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public prostitution. So the proletarians can't have a regular family life because somebody's always working, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of like how the queer theorists today say that we can't have childhood innocence because not all kids get to have an innocent childhood, so we're going to abolish basically childhood innocence. Same thing. They're going to abolish the family because some of the proletarians have this crappy working life, so they don't have a normal family, so they're going to abolish the family. The bourgeois family, he says, will vanish as a matter of course when its complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. So they do want to abolish the family. They're very clear about it, and they say exactly what it means. But you say we destroy the most hallowed of relations and we replace home education by social. So no more homeschooling. Now we're going to have social or public education. Right? And your education, exclamation mark. Is that not also social? So this is their classic dialectical inversion. The thing you do is already the thing we want to do. We're just going to do it different and better, and your way is bad. Even though it's not nearly the same thing. We've talked about that on a bunch of podcasts. In your education, is that not also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society and by means of schools, etc.? The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education. They do but seek to alter the character of that intervention and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. So there's a classic dialectical inversion. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parents and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more by the action of modern industry all the family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. But you, communists, would introduce community of women, screams the bourgeoisie in chorus. So that, I think, means communal prostitution, by the way. But you so notice that all this is them arguing with people who make sense. But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the bourgeoisie in chorus. Because why? Because they want to abolish the family. They also want to abolish marriage. Well, here's their explanation. The bourgeois sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears that that's basically, there's feminism right there. Okay. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common and naturally can come to no conclusion that so iron law of Vogue projections happening here, can come to no conclusion that the lot of the being common to all will likewise fall to women. So he's like, the only reason you think that if we shared all the women in common, that it would become like mass prostitution and exploitation of women, is because you already think in terms of exploiting women. This is a classic, this is a Darvo moment. Deny, attack, reverse the roles of victim and offender. He, meaning the bourgeois, has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. So they've just foisted in this weird assumption of the communists into the thing, blamed the bourgeois for misunderstanding it according to that weird assumption, and then said, no, we're going to have something magically totally different. For the rest, he says, or they say, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeois at the community of women which they pretend is to be openly and officially established by the communists. Community of women, by the way, again, means basically mass prostitution. The communists, all the women are to be shared in common by all the men. The communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed from almost time immemorial. So again, with the dialect, we don't have to introduce it. It's already there anyway. So we're just going to make it better. Our bourgeois, not content with having wives and daughters of their proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, takes the greatest pleasure in seducing others' wives. So see, some of you cheat on your wives or whatever your marriage arrangements are, and therefore it doesn't matter. The communists are just ahead of you. Bourgeois marriage, they say, is in reality, imagine how weird it is that this is in your friggin' manifesto, by the way, about economics, so to speak. Bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives in common, and thus, at the most, what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce in substitution for a hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. See, everybody's already hooking up with everybody else's wives anyway. That's what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels say. But they pretend they don't. So all we're going to do is just make it open and legal instead of secret and private, which sounds an awful lot like queer theory stuff and the weird polyamory push that they do, doesn't it? For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from that system, that is, of prostitution, both public and private. Plus, therefore, what they added in addition, plus, there won't be prostitution anyway, because nobody's going to have any money because we're going to live in communism. So you can't buy and sell women, which is prostitution, if you can't buy and sell. See how it works? This is, first of all, again, I just reiterate how weird it is that that's in their manifesto. Like, literally, they're answering common charges made against them in their manifesto, and they're at the point of the writing of the manifesto of the Communist Party, it's already such a huge argument that you're going to turn all women into mass prostitutes that they have to have this argument, and in the middle of it, they're like, yeah, kind of we are, but you already do it anyway, so like, what's the big deal? Holy moly. The communists, they go on arguing with everybody, are further reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men, they say, have no country. That's a way of saying yes, what they are. We cannot take from them what they have not got. Turns out that miscalculation right there caused fascism in Italy, in Germany, and in Spain. That miscalculation. Antonio Gramsci's entire cultural Marxist project arose because the Italian Marxists, or Italian workers, wouldn't organize into Marxist parties for the International during World War I. They wanted to concentrate in Italian nationalist projects instead. Totally got that wrong. The working men do have a country, and they care about it a lot. We cannot take from what they have not got. Big miscalculation. Since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation, it is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. See, it's National Socialist instead of the bourgeois nationalism. National differences and antagonisms between, this is the first step he's arguing is National Socialism. National differences and antagonism between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to the freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and the conditions of life corresponding thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another will also be put an end to, his grammar is not that great. The exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. See, as they all become socialists, they won't have any reason to fight each other, and they'll all just become together kumbaya. The charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. They just don't deal with those. Does it require a deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conception, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and his social life? What else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. So don't tell me they don't accept elite theory. They certainly do. Just like the woke right, but they don't have to deal with ideological or religious or philosophical objections to their program, because those, they say, are just derivative to the conditions and the existing ruling class that you already have. They're not actually eternal ideas. They're all contingent. So the relativism comes in. When people speak of the ideas that revolutionize society, they do but express that fact within the old society, the elements of a new one have been created. There's some secret hermeticism and Gnosticism, and that the dissolution of the old ideas keeps even pace with the dissolution of the old conditions of existence. When the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religions were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of religious liberty and of freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the way of free competition within the domain of knowledge. Now, notice that these guys they're Gnostics in the sense that they're going to claim the mantle of rationality. So when the woke right make the argument that Enlightenment thought proceeds to communism, they're not really understanding what they're up against. But here's the seed of it, kind of. And so there's a yes and no to this, and it's really complicated. It's this whole own podcast, so I'm not going to do it all. But the Scottish Enlightenment and the English Enlightenment are very different from the French and German and continental Enlightenments. They're very different. And so they're kind of right about the European Enlightenment leading into it, and they're very wrong about the English and Scottish Enlightenment leading into it. They're not the same thing. And the American Revolution versus the French Revolution is kind of the, paradigm comparison point, right? Okay. So let's see. When Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas. Okay, so that there is talking and making the same blend of enlightenments, English and Scottish on the one hand, continental French, German on the other. But the French-German one, that's irrelevant. I don't want to do that again. But the thing is that this whole idea of rationalism is being co-opted. The German Enlightenment, in particular, Kant, then going into through Schelling and Schiller into Hegel, and Hegel through Feuerbach into Marx and others. This particular vein of rationalism, which became critical rationalism, critique of pure reason and so on from Kant, this critical rationalism and Hegelian dialectics became a new kind of rationalism that's a splinter. It's not the same. It derives from the same continental problems of people like Descartes and so on, but it's its own splinter into socialism defining what rationalism means, right? So I'm trying to get to that point and try to figure out how to say it cleanly. The communists believed that communism's the only rational thing. So all the other schools of rationalism are irrational to them. That's the point later of Dialectic of Enlightenment, really, from by Horkheimer and Adorno and their School of Critical Theory in the 1940s. But basically, here he's, first of all, just kind of got it messed up. Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas. That's not quite right. Rationalist ideas take on two fundamentally different characters. They have two fundamentally different ontologies or metaphysical commitments. That's kind of where I started my discussion at the very beginning. One of which is based in realism, which went to America. One of which is based in idealism, which went through the continent. And idealist rationalism then had a weird splinter that's not even all of idealist rationalism that became Marxism. Okay, and so that's all he thinks. And so what he's doing is they see themselves, the communists see themselves as the correct torchbearers of the rationalist project, the way that it's supposed to go, in contradiction to America or any of the capitalist project or the classical liberal project. Okay, so anyway, this is why you have Gramsci later echoing this idea that socialism is precisely the religion that must overcome Christianity. Imagine if we had it here. Marx says, when the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religions were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. Now imagine we add in Gramsci's observation by way of Marx, which is, and then eventually a rationalist splinter of Marxism is going to fully overcome Christianity in the end. But what Marx goes on to continue with is the ideas of religious liberty and freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the sway of free competition within the domain of knowledge. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religious, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survived this change. There are, besides, eternal truths, such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. But communism, this he's still characterizing one last objection, but communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality, instead constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. So that's the challenge, and what he says is, what does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in the developments of class antagonisms that assume different forms at different epochs, but whatever form they may have taken, the one fact in common to all past ages vis-a-vis the exploitation of one part of society by the other. Or actually it's V-I-Z, the exploitation of one part of society to the other. No wonder then, he says, that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms or general ideas which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonisms. So he's like, actually that accusation, yeah, but what you're saying is that what you think are universal truths are only universal to the state of class antagonism, and when class antagonism is overcome by the communists, then we'll get rid of those. So he goes on to say, the communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations, so no wonder that its development involved the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. So in other words, yes, in fact, we're going to throw out all that stuff. But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. We have seen above, so now they're done with arguing with people that aren't there. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of the ruling class to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, that is, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class. This is what they went on to become called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Now you know why the Soviet Union and China did what they did. The People's Republic of China. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property. There's your dictatorship of the proletariat, and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but which in the course of the movement outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. Did you catch what's going to happen? The proletariat will use democracy to get itself put into power, at which point it will take all control away from the bourgeoisie. They will centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, which will be the Communist Party as the organized faction of the proletariat, becoming the new dictatorial ruling class, and it will do things that don't seem like they're going to work. and they're going to use absolutely despotic means to make it work, because eventually it will work if you just do it hard enough. He then continues, he says it's going to look different in different countries, but what are they going to look like? Nevertheless, in most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. 1, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6, centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands, the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8, equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. That means literally a military cadre like the Army Corps of Engineers that does work, maybe engineering, but especially farming. So you're going to operate farming like a military operation to maximize production. 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equity distribution of the populace over the country. 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production, etc., etc. Yes, there are 2 et ceteras there. When in the course of development class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. So that's a very weird view of politics. And power, is that what the woke right covets when they say they want to have and use power? The organized power of one class for oppressing another? If the proletariat, so all politics is oppression, is the logic, the woke logic here. So therefore they are justified in having despotic means to oppress in order to overcome oppression in their theory. If the proletariat during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms, of classes generally, and will have thereby abolished its own supremacy as a class. So there's the magic spell. But when it defeats all the classes, it doesn't need to be a class anymore, and then it'll get rid of itself. In place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And that's the end of the main body. There is a third chapter and so on. The main body of the Communist Manifesto. It's as far as I'm going to read. Obviously, this is very long. I didn't think, in fact, it was going to be this long. So thank you for listening. I think a lot of it stands on its own. It's like I said, the point of the Communist Manifesto is to lay out the communist worldview, which is that all of history is the antagonism of contending classes that are intrinsically in a fight all the time, sometimes hidden, sometimes visible, and that fight always ends in either the revolution and reconstitution of society. It means new constitution, by the way, reconstitution. Or we have a constitution because our country was constituted by that legal document, or is constituted by that legal document, and there's going to be a reconstitution after the revolution. So it's either going to end in the revolutionary reconstitution of the society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So it's going to be this class conflict eventually becomes a total war that either ends society or hands it over to revolutionary victors, is what he's saying. And there are 2 in the modern era. Basically, they explain, I should say, that the capitalist liberal era is characterized by a conflict that has condensed to 2 classes, bourgeoisie versus proletariat, which is the owners versus the workers. And that conflict is inevitable. and increasing. And what's going to happen is a splinter group is going to break off from the bourgeoisie and to lead the workers through the revolution, and they will seize power. That's the communists. The communists will seize power, and they will rule with a absolutely despotic power grab, dictatorship of the proletariat, to force a communistic vision onto society, even though it doesn't look like it's going to work. Does it involve abolishing religion? Yes. State? Yes. Well, not their semi-state. Does it involve abolishing religion? Yes. Family? Yes. Children, in the sense of having relationships with their parents? Yes. Homeschooling or any private education? Yes. Private ownership? Yes. Individuality? Yes. Very explicitly. And so that they're going to use that to force people into a communistic mode, which means abolishing all private property. Now, I remind you from my previous lectures that I've done, for example, where I talked about the one earlier, As Below, So Above, is the third in a 3-lecture series I gave about the theology of communism. The way that this actually works is that through what Marx elsewhere called the processes of praxis and inversion of praxis. Praxis is the activism you do in order to agitate society to get your revolution. But they believe, as he indicated here in the Manifesto, that the conditions of society basically condition you into being who you are. That's called the inversion of praxis. And so society is constantly brainwashing everybody to go along with society, is the idea. So they do this activism, that's praxis, and you transform society to make it socialist, and then the socialist society, led from the top with the dictatorship of the proletariat, will now brainwash everybody to be socialist. As they become more socialist, you get a better government that's going to be even more dictatorial in the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that's going to brainwash people to be even more socialist, because people are made by the conditions of their society, but then people get to make some changes in the conditions of their society through revolutionary agitation. That's the cycle of communism. Literally, the whole program operates off of the belief that society brainwashes you into who you are. Then the doctrine in old Marxism was called material determinism. The doctrine in woke left Marxism is called structural determinism, but they're basically the same thing. The conditions of society force you to be who you are. You can't operate really outside of them except by awakening to the socio-gnostic Marxist view and doing agitating propaganda and agitating activity or activism to make some changes that you then force on people to brainwash them into a more socialist mode. And that's the purpose of their seizing the means of production. They're seizing the means of production of society, thus man, so that new men can seize the means of production, because the revolution is going to be continuous, around and around again. So new men can seize the means of production of society, thus man. And you transform man back to his communal or social or species being nature, as Marx outlined 4 years earlier in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. So this is the doctrine. The short version of the Communist Manifesto is believing the communist worldview of a split into two contending classes that will either have a revolution or destroy everything when they fight. One class is oppressor, the other class is oppressed. The oppressed actually should rise up and win and have this revolution, and that the communists are their most advanced segment. They're a breakaway from the upper class who are going to lead the lower class and then thus become the rulers to engage that process. So it's a gigantic power grab for the parasitical, bourgeois, envious, resentful communists who break away and mobilize the working class to do their bidding in order to steal power and rule under a doctrine that is, they said, not made up, but is 100% made up and completely nonsense. In fact, it is a Manichaean socio-gnostic view of how society works, whether through social forces or economic forces, which they even say in the manifesto are the same thing. So that's a unfortunately almost 3-hour introduction to the Communist Manifesto. Thank you for listening. I won't drag this out with more analysis. Now you've heard it. We'll do a second episode where I go through the what do they call them? The principles or whatever. It's like a Q&A in the Communist Manifesto about all of the principles of communism is what it's called. So we'll do a second episode on that soon. I don't think it'll be as long, but who knows? Turns out it wasn't 13 or 14 pages as I alleged in the beginning. It was more like 22, so that's why this was so long. Thanks for listening. I will talk to you again as soon as possible.